I made 4 of my students ruin their own vacations, spend a fortune on last-minute travel, and sit through hours of legal torture that crushed their souls. It all started when they tried to pass off someone else's shoddy work as their own. My name is Dr. Alastair Finch. I'm a cancer researcher, but I also serve as a guest professor at a university school of medicine, where I teach my specialty, medical imaging. Most people hear imaging and think of the machines, MRI, CT scans, and so on, but a huge part of my work is what happens after the image is taken. It's about image processing, which means a lot of coding. On some days, I feel less like a groundbreaking researcher and more like a glorified IT guy. As any programmer will tell you, writing code is a deeply personal act. With enough experience, you can recognize a person's style just by looking at their code, like identifying an artist by their brushstrokes. This little detail would soon become very important. I'm in my late 20s and not originally from this country, so this was my first year as a guest professor. I could tell some students saw me as this young, gullible, foreign guy they could easily get one over on. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The grading for my module included 2 reports, each worth 10% of their final grade. As I began grading the submissions, I noticed a pattern. A small group of students had found reports from previous years online and just copy-pasted them, only bothering to change the name on the front page. It was a facepalm moment, truly. The reports they'd chosen to copy weren't even good, they were riddled with errors. I knew this because I'd already reviewed past reports to establish a fair grading baseline for my students. I gave them all a 0 and moved on. In the following days, some of these students would casually ask me in the hallways how the reports were looking. Of course, I couldn't say anything until the grades were officially released. Then came Marco. He was one of the cheaters, a 98% match on the plagiarism checker. He approached me, asking when the grades would be out, and launched into this whole sob story about how hard he'd worked on his reports. He claimed his exam hadn't gone well and that he was desperately counting on his report grades to pass the class. Submitting another person's work is one thing, but standing there and lying directly to my face was another level of disrespect. I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my composure. Right then, a plan began to form. He made a critical mistake at that moment, brazenly lying to a man whose entire career was built on spotting anomalies. He was completely unaware that this single lie would lead to his own downfall. My exam was the last one of the semester, after which students typically scatter for vacations while waiting for their grades to be posted online. I graded the exams and entered all the scores into my spreadsheet. 4 students had a 0 on their reports because of the plagiarism. I saw that if I changed their report grade from a 0 to a 50%, they would barely fail the entire module, but they would fail nonetheless. The trap was set. It was on. Now, some might wonder why I didn't just report them for plagiarism and have them kicked out, which is the policy at many schools. The truth is, I had already taken the issue to my boss, the course director. He explicitly told me not to report them, because the university was terrified of any potential legal action from students, at any cost. I wasn't even allowed to formally accuse them of cheating, so I had to find another way. To be fair, I decided to bump everyone else's grades slightly. A few students with bad, but original, reports ended up barely passing thanks to this curve. They knew the material, they just weren't great at report writing, and I felt they deserved to pass. University policy entitles students to an appointment to review their grades after they are published. They sit with you, go over their work, and try to convince you to find a few extra points somewhere to push them over the passing line. I knew the cheaters would come. In their minds, they had already fooled me once, and now they had half their reports grade to bargain for. I just had to wait for the emails. The same day the grades went live, my inbox pinged. It was them. They wrote about how hard they'd worked on their reports and couldn't understand how they only got 50%. They wanted an appointment. I was ecstatic. Sure, I replied. Let's review your grades. This reveals the students' greatest fatal flaw, their arrogance. They had already started their vacations, some of them hundreds of miles away, and begged for an online appointment. No can do. I wrote back. University policy requires all grade reviews to be in person. You have 3 days to show up. Otherwise the grades are locked for the year. Also university policy. So they came. They cut their family vacations short, caught planes, and spent hours on buses and trains to make it back in time. One by one, they sat down with me. Now, I could have just shown them the plagiarism report and sent them on their way, but I had something far more painful in mind. These meetings usually take 10 minutes, mine would take hours. I pulled out their exam and their report. Remember, they copied bad reports filled with errors they didn't understand. I began to go through it, line by line. Marco, can you explain your reasoning for this section here? I'd ask, pointing to a chunk of flawed code. He'd stare at it, his brow furrowed. I thought it was the most efficient way. He'd mumble, unable to provide any real logic because it wasn't his logic. Efficient how? I'd press. Can you walk me through the steps? Silence. He didn't know. It wasn't his work. Point by point, mistake by mistake. I calmly explained why it was wrong, lecturing him on the exact material we had already covered in class. I made it long. I made it boring. I made it excruciatingly painful. For hours. I did this with each of them across those 3 days. They all came in with the same story. I worked so hard on this. A little smirk on their faces, thinking the gullible foreign professor was an easy mark. But as the hours ticked by, I watched their expressions change. The arrogance melted into confusion, then into dawning horror, and finally into despair as their hopes of passing were slowly, methodically crushed before their eyes. They realized that I knew, and I wasn't giving up a single point. At that point, they tried to escape. Look, Marco said, his voice strained, I see I'm not going to pass. Can we just finish this? I looked at him calmly. We need to finish the review of your grades, I said flatly. It's university policy. And I just kept going, extending their misery for another hour or two. It was legal torture, plain and simple. It was glorious. In the end, every single one of them left my office with a crushed soul and a failing grade. They knew that I had caught them, that I had baited them, and that they had walked right into my trap. They had ruined their vacations, spent money on travel, wasted precious summer days, and gotten absolutely nothing to show for it. They didn't just fail, they were defeated. As one commenter later pointed out, these students weren't dragged into my office. They came willingly to argue that their cheating deserved a passing grade, and I simply let them try. The best part? Next year, they have to repeat the module, with me. As the last one walked out the door, I gave him a pleasant smile. I hope you enjoy what's left of your summer, I said. See you next year. Ultimately, these students learned a hard lesson. Plagiarism isn't a teachable moment at the university level, especially in a medical field where shortcuts can have dire consequences. They thought they could cheat the system, but instead, they played themselves. So, what do you think? Was my brand of revenge a masterclass in teaching a lesson, or did I take it a step too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.